Capitalism. It's what you live in. It's what we all live in. Capitalism is the economic system through which our entire modern society is structured and has been for the last give or take 400 years. An economic system is the structure in which a society organizes its economy, determining how goods are produced, why they are produced, who produces them, and who receives them. Whether it's governments, businesses, public services, militaries, charities, or anywhere else that goods or services are exchanged for currency, you're experiencing capitalism. Many people, generally the people who have benefited most from it, or have been conditioned to think that they have, agree that it's the best thing since diced bread. Personally ordained by Jesus Christ himself, and while not without its flaws, still objectively the only good, just, and moral way to organize a global financial structure. We'll explore just how little sense that makes soon. But first, how did we get here? Now, before capitalism, we had feudalism. Feudalism was an economic system that existed across much of Europe for roughly 600 years. In this system, if one was born as a lord, they were well off, well fed, and had a bright future to look forward to as long as they put in a fraction of the effort people expected of them. The feudal lords owned the land, all of the resources within it, and made all decisions regarding how the resources were used and whom they went to. Those not born into nobility we called serfs, and they got a life of abject servitude to one of these lords in exchange for food, shelter, and protection from a few of the many horrific ways to die in medieval Europe. Human rights weren't really a thing for serfs, and they were forbidden from moving between towns and cities. If the lord you worked for was a pretty good dude, because obviously they were all dudes, hey, you got lucky, and maybe you get to live a comfortable life. As comfortable a life as a 13th century peasant could live anyway. If the lord you worked for was a sadistic, murderous, egomaniacal slave driver who demanded far more effort than what you could ever realistically put in, he was legally allowed to kill you. In simplest of terms, it was an economic system built on the exploitation of labor from the lower classes to generate economic resources, which were then consolidated in the hands of a small percentage of nobles at the top of the social hierarchy. Thank God we got rid of that. Now we have capitalism, which does away with the rigidly defined caste system. Where feudalism only existed in some areas, capitalism has more or less crept on into every little economic nook and cranny across the globe. It is a system where if one is born into a wealthy family that holds capital, capitalists if you will, they are well fed, well off, and have a bright future to look forward to as long as they put in a fraction of the effort people expect of them. Capitalists own the land, all the resources within it, and make all decisions regarding how the resources are used and whom they go to. As for those born without capital, they get a life of often more subtle abject servitude to employers, having their labor compensated with wages you can exchange for food and shelter. Some employees even get extra benefits, such as money for retirement, a company car, or in more primitive countries, access to health care. Human rights sometimes do exist for modern wage earners, depending on the country you live in and how much the government decides to care about employee rights abuses at the time. Workers are also permitted to relocate, if they can afford it. If you manage to land a job that pays well and the employer you work for is a pretty good dude, or gal, because girl bosses are allowed in some places now, you may well have the opportunity to live a comfortably cushy lifestyle. Unimaginably cushy and comfortable to basically every human being who lived prior to 1950. If your employer is a greedy megalomaniacal capitalist hell-bent on creating the most efficient company the world has ever seen, who demands far more effort than what you could ever realistically put in, they're allowed to fire you. Which, if your country doesn't have an adequate system of unemployment benefits, means you no longer have the means to buy food or shelter. Meaning employers in some places are legally allowed to kill you. In simplest of terms, it is an economic system built on the exploitation of labor from the lower classes to generate economic resources, which are then consolidated in the hands of a small percentage of capitalists at the top of the social hierarchy. While these two systems may sound similar, under feudalism we did have affordable housing. Now, am I being glib here because I take issue with capitalism? Just a little bit. It is undeniable that while under capitalism, life has become better for millions, even billions of people worldwide, with humanity achieving innumerable revolutionary technological advancements, even just within our lifetimes. Compared to the conditions that people endured for thousands of years before us, many of us now have the opportunity to be happier, healthier, and wealthier than ever before. Many diseases have been eradicated. We can not die of tooth decay thanks to the miracle of toothbrushes. Where we once had to drunkenly scrawl a letter to an X on parchment with a quill and ink at 3 a.m., we can now text them instantly. We can like, we can subscribe, we can even fly. The problem is though, there are still millions, even billions of people worldwide whose lives haven't improved or have become far worse under the conditions created by capitalism. The development of capitalism kicked off an era of brutal colonization, where wealthy countries searched for distant lands in order to plunder valuable resources, so they could then economically or militarily compete against other wealthy countries that also searched for distant lands and plundered them for valuable resources. Indigenous people who lived in these lands didn't exactly get a vote on whether or not these dipshits could come in and set up shop. They had their land and homes destroyed, to then be tortured, murdered, or sold into slavery and shipped off to places far from everything and everyone they had ever known. The people who weren't directly killed by colonizers were often wiped out by the many diseases brought over by the travelers that they had never been exposed to. Ya boy Christopher Columbus, you know, the guy that has a whole fucking day named after him? He was known to mutilate indigenous people who displeased him and send them back to their villages as a warning to others. Or keep child sex slaves. You know, a real great guy. He was considered particularly awful and brutal by other civilized people at the time, but his shenanigans were left unchecked long enough to cause untold devastation for thousands of people. Supposed heroes of history like Christopher Columbus weren't exploring the seven seas for thrill, the spirit of adventure, or the sake of discovery. They embarked on missions with the sole purpose of exploiting the land and resources of helpless people to generate capital and make profit. Fast forward to the late 18th century, where the Industrial Revolution began in Britain and made its way to many other European countries and the US. The Industrial Revolution saw monumental advancements in the way Western nations produced goods, paving the way to industries that could mass produce a wide variety of new, high-quality items and building materials. Millions of new jobs were created during this period, offering opportunities not previously available to the many poor rural folk, who then started migrating to the fast-growing cities seeking a better life. But the reality was often less than optimistic for people who began working in the factories. Being forced to work for low wages, 12 to 16 hours a day, 7 days a week, under incredibly stressful and dangerous conditions. The cities often had cramped, poor quality living conditions for workers and quickly became overcrowded and heavily polluted. Child labor laws weren't really a thing yet either, so if a family couldn't afford to make ends meet, little Timmy was off to the coal mines for his 7th birthday. Happy birthday, kiddo! Here's some black lung. Workers generally, straight up, did not have a good time. But capitalist owners who benefited from the exploitation of their labor started to see more sweet, juicy, delicious profits than ever before. This isn't to say that well-paid and fulfilling middle-class jobs didn't exist, but they wouldn't have been possible without the exploitation of those on the bottom of the hierarchy. Fast forward to today, where wealthy nations rely on the exploitation of labor and resources from poor countries, then use the benefits to compete economically and militarily against other wealthy nations that also rely on the exploitation of labor and resources from poor countries. Many of the same indigenous people who suffered during the outset of colonization still suffer today, by having pipelines plonked down on their native land, having their water sources flooded with toxic waste from various industries, or just treated as second-class citizens, because some people still haven't gotten the memo about how racism isn't a good thing. The labor practices and wages in Western countries are generally far better now than what they were during the Industrial Revolution, but worker rights abuses, poverty wages, and poor workplace conditions still exist, with the most extreme exploitation being exported to workers in the third world countries who now make most of our things. The capitalists in their countries create the inhumane workplace conditions which allow for the production of cheap goods. Then the capitalists in our countries buy those goods and sell them back to us. All in all, life still sucks for indigenous people worldwide, and work still sucks for the vast majority of employees. Which is already not great, but it turns out we never fixed the pollution problem. In fact, you might have possibly heard about a little thing called climate change. Ever since humans have organized themselves into societies and began farming crops, global temperatures have been rising ever so slightly for thousands of years. But since the Industrial Revolution, the process has sped up so significantly that humans are literally facing extinction. Some people will tell you that climate change isn't real. They either do not understand the science, or they profit from the industries that are causing it, and their opinion should be disregarded entirely. But don't take it from me that climate change is the biggest threat to our survival we could ever possibly face. Take it from all scientists. If we don't find a way to solve it, wildfires will continue to burn out of control. Hurricanes will become more powerful and more frequent. More of our infrastructure will fail regularly, and all of the bees will die. Because you see, according to all known laws of aviation, there is no way a bee should be able to fly. Its wings are too small to get its fat little body off the ground, but the bee of course flies anyway. Unless it's on fucking fire. Now, for many people in many places, climate change has already reached a critical point, and these people will either die or be forced to take refuge somewhere else. Though if we act now, there is plenty we can do to mitigate the most devastating effects of climate change. But you see, capitalism isn't designed to solve existential threats to humanity. It's designed to generate profit. The people in charge of stuff, the politicians, work for the people who have all the money, the capitalists. And since the capitalists make their money by exploiting the Earth's natural resources and shooting carbon into the ozone, the politicians are just doing their jobs by never doing anything to solve climate change. Capitalism incentivizes companies that ignore long-term consequences in favor of short-term economic benefits. So the system isn't broken. The system is functioning as intended, and if it continues to function as it is now, soon every season will be summer. In a bad way. Humanity has made phenomenal technological, medical, and social advancements since the beginning of capitalism. But it wasn't capitalism itself that made those advancements. The wheel, advanced construction, telescopes, printing presses, and trebuchets were all invented before capitalism, and further innovations will continue long after capitalism rears its ugly head. Innovation comes from people. It was people all along. People have always found new ways to farm crops, new ways to stop diseases, new ways to get high, new ways to kill each other, and new ways to organize economies. Capitalism isn't the end of history. We, the people, can do better for ourselves and for each other. Only then can we solve the issue of climate change and improve the living conditions of workers worldwide. Now, there are other proposed economic systems out there, such as socialism or... They found me. I don't know how they did it, but they found me.